This week we're talking about sudden death.
Yes. So last week, the Liverpool player and Diogo Jota and his brother Andre Silva were killed in a car accident.
Yeah.
Very early hours Friday morning.
Yeah.
And it's kind of been top item in the news in this country, probably in Portugal, where they were both from, for quite the last few days, and it's kind of it's kind of captured quite a lot of. I suppose this is a cultural moment, even beyond for the whole of football and football fans, but even kind of beyond that.
So it's top item in the news. It was early hours of Thursday morning. It's that long ago.
Thursday morning, okay, yeah.
Thursday morning, and then the vigil was Friday night, funeral Saturday morning, and it was top item on BBC News. It would have been top item of a lot of national newspapers, and I think we were aware also over the weekend that there's been the floods in Texas that have resulted in the last time I saw it was 91 deaths, and that I suppose that in some respects shows that sudden death can happen in quite shocking ways. So people, we're not talking about a physical ailment like a heart attack or an aneurysm, or those are sudden deaths, but this is like a fatality where a tragic natural accident or an accident on the road happens, and there's like external circumstances that conspire to mean that this person dies at this time. The floods in Texas would be a similar thing. The floods in Texas show that this is not that this is something that can happen, and they show us, sudden death isn't just an aberration. There are sudden deaths happening around the world every day. And so what we want to talk about today is how do we understand that and how do we respond to that as Christians? Because you can't kind of brace yourself and live your life preparing for a sudden death, but we should understand what it means for us as Christians to live in the context of those kind of settings, because we don't know when we will find ourselves in them or responding to people who are in them.
Brilliant. Now, if we think about, we start in this podcast thinking about culture, there is something about culture whereby these two news events, the Texas thing is utterly tragic, but I guarantee you that if the Texas thing had happened and the Diogo Jota death, and interesting enough, it's Diogo and his brother, but we talk about Diogo more, and we'll come on to, we probably wouldn't have had the conversation about doing this podcast. And if you look back, you will see that the things that rise up seriously in public consciousness is usually when one person, quite often before their time, so young, dies. Somebody's famous who dies young. So yes, there was a massive public outpouring when the Queen died, but there was an element of that's thankfulness, because this lady was in her 90s and she'd served.
She'd lived her life. We're so grateful for her. It was
and that's one person. But when one person, if you compare that to, say, the death of Princess Diana, which is 30 years ago, or there are these moments when something happens to one person that captures the public imagination. Why do you think that might be?
Because there is a life expectancy that we perceive to be a right, and because we have essentially replaced the concept of life after death with retirement within our culture, the idea of being denied what is ours and what we should progress to is offensive to us. Back to the stuff we've been talking about in terms of previous weeks, actually, if the autonomous self and the right that I have to die also is a right that I can believe that I have the right to choose when to die.
Yeah.
And so the idea that I can have my life taken away from me, or my loved one can have their life taken away from me in a random, arbitrary way, is offensive to the worldview that we have. We are not in control of events. Events beyond us can decimate the rest of our lives.
And we're made for relationship. So the Bible tells us that Adam and Eve are placed in a garden to be in relationship with one another and with God. And it tells us that the end will be back in a city in relationship with one another and with God. And there is something about the famous person who inhabits our screens or our airtime or whatever, who even if we don't know them, we feel like we know them. And so if you have, putting it bluntly, a bus going off a road with 50 people who we don't know it's all in it. We feel we are moved.
Yeah.
But when somebody who we kind of think we might know or feel
Yeah.
slightly invested in,
Yeah, and has affected us.
and has affected us, suddenly dies, it affects us in a far more emotional and raw way than when we hear about anybody else. So
and in a postmodern world where meta narratives don't exist, mini narratives are more important, and therefore the capacity for us to connect with other people's stories and to see our story somehow interwoven or interplaying with their story is really important. So if you listen to any of the kind of the podcasters talking about the Diogo Jota death, there's a lot of airtime given to people talking about not their experience of, well, that people are talking about their experience of him as a footballer, but they're also talking about how their stories connect with this story, and they're imagining the story of his loved ones who are grieving through the lens of their experience of this, and a lot of raw emotion is out there in terms of people expressing grief and imagining what it must be like for those who are grieving.
So we have these. So in our current culture, we talked about this actually using football and Trent Alexander-Arnold, a former Liverpool player, a couple of months ago. That we have these people who play these roles in culture, who are almost like small idols to us. We're invested in them relationally. We feel like we're on a journey with them, and we place our hopes and dreams into how they do. And in a character like Diogo Jota, he was very much he was 28 and he was a pretty normal guy. At one point, he was the world's #1 FIFA, which is a computer game for football player, as well as being and so he actually used to engage with lots of people through the internet. So there were loads of people playing football online who felt like they knew him because
they actually did play him online.
They played him online.
Is this really Diogo Jota?
And so there's this kind of invested in him, and then there's also a sense where this is a particularly kind of fan thing where all fans at some stage imagine themselves where their heroes are, and the more normal their hero is. And so there's this beautiful scene from when Liverpool lifted the Premier League only 2 months ago, of the whole of the Kop, which is one of the stands at Anfield, singing the Diogo Jota song to Diogo Jota and him singing it with them. And this sense of we're all in this together. So there is this sense where in this culture we might not know somebody, but we feel like we know somebody.
Yeah.
And then when they suddenly pass, it has an impact on us. And that's kind of the nature of a kind of connected world.
Yeah.
In a way that, sort of even 30, 40 years ago, a player something like that happening to a footballer or to, it would have only movie stars that would have been normal. Whereas now in our connected world, there are far more people who play this. I kind of feel like I know you and I don't know you. So then the shock comes.
And so when death comes into that setting, the way that we look at the world in terms of relationship and the need for relationship at a close level, but also the how those lives are connected in a more distant way, and that sense of the right to life are all obliterated in one moment, because we no longer can say that we do have a right to life and that we can manage our own health and vitality to a particular point. We no longer can have the certainty of what it means to relate to other people within that. And it's the feeling of security that we gain from relating to people at a distance is no longer there in the same way, because we can't know that they will be there to create the same stories, and then that others will be there as well.
And then it will bring up, for each of us, it'll bring up different emotions that are linked to our own stories. So I hope you don't mind me asking, James, but you and your family have been through a death recently.
Yeah.
And I presume like news like this, even though it's somebody who you don't know, will bring you back to that.
Oh, yeah. So I did a funeral recently, and I was talking with somebody who's at the funeral. I said, more often than not, when you look out from my position at a funeral, you see that the first 3 rows are filled with the next of kin and the family, generally speaking, and they are all in a state of kind of shock and bewilderment. And often that's just about the sheer practicalities of getting to the funeral, where we in the UK just throw administration at people, and then the next 3 rows back are actually often people who have a form of connection with the person. That means that they're probably friends or family who kind of have an appreciation but aren't quite affected by the shock in the same way, and they're often the ones who are actually able to look back and to listen to what's being said and to grieve. And there's often more grief actually going on. They may be talking to them that you realise that actually they're also grieving the funeral that they were at 6 months ago. And they're thinking about, so they're kind of grieving generally. And then the back lot, sometimes when you're taking funerals, don't quite know why they're there. I suppose that's a kind of a good illustration of actually grief can be really shocking. But also there can be that kind of actually I'm at a funeral, I'm grieving generally, because actually life is filled with loss.
And then the other thing that comes, and we can move to theology, I think the other thing that then comes in these moments is whether it be the grief that you might be suddenly, you experience with the death of a really close loved one, or the kind of thoughts that might go through your head when it's like a news item like this, that then there are thoughts that'll pop into your head that aren't quite right, and that kind of shame you. So I'm like, one of the thoughts that popped into my head is about the guy. There's a guy at Liverpool called Richard Hughes, who's director of football, and I had a thought which was like, oh, he's going to have to go and sign another striker now.
Yeah.
And then you feel guilty for thinking that, because a man has died, and his wife and children.
All of those thoughts.
Yeah, and then at the same time, you've had a fan popped into your head and gone, oh, we're going to have to go and sign a striker. And actually, Richard Hughes, who will have known Diogo, that will at some point that'll come crashing into his head. Is all my job for the summer was to sign these players, but not to replace Diogo Jota. Now I have to do that, and then he'll feel guilty for thinking that.
Yeah.
But actually, that's kind of, and that's the other thing that happens in these moments is, the Queen dies, and you go, oh, I remember thinking, oh, I'm going to have to open a book of condolence, and then you go, and then you're brought short by your own self-centeredness.
Yes. Yeah.
As it were.
Yeah, and I suppose that's when I used the word obliterated. I think it. Shocking, sudden deaths obliterate the worldview that we have, and they leave people stunned and utterly shocked, because everything that they presumed was certain about their future. I think there was something that he put on Diogo Jota put on his social media that used the word forever.
Yeah.
After his wedding day, which was 11 days before his death, and that phrase, they use that term forever, just shows you what it means for all of those certainties, all those things that we presume to be certain are just obliterated, and then actually what is left in those moments.
Yeah, we'll move to theology, because I was thinking, like, when you just thinking back, as you said, he got married 11 days beforehand, and both you and I have been married, and I don't imagine, I know I didn't, that people stand in a wedding and they say, in sickness and health, for better, for worse, for rich, for poor, in sickness and health, till death us do part. Yeah. And I think when you're saying that, you the words that jump out are health, richer, better. Yeah. You don't stand there getting married thinking about worse, sickness, ill health, and death. You think about the good stuff, and then suddenly this comes crashing in. The thing, we're going to move to theology, because the thing that does then happen in these moments is people scrabble around to find meaning.
Yes.
So we've talked enough about in this podcast about we live in a world where there is no kind of coherent shared sense of meaning, and there are people who say there is no meaning. We talked about that in last week's podcast, but yet suddenly when this happens, people yearn for meaning. And yesterday, Liverpool had the football club had like a special that they put out. It's on YouTube, where they kind of a tribute to Diogo Jota, and they began with there were 4 people who were kind of being interviewed, and one was a former Liverpool player, one was one of the key Liverpool journalists, one was probably one of the key Liverpool podcasters, and the other guy was the Liverpool chaplain. And what was really interesting was in that first 10 minutes, they asked the player and the journalist and the podcaster one question each, and then they pretty much had a 10-minute conversation with the chaplain. Yeah. Because in that moment, the guy doing the interview knew that the player, the journalist, and the podcaster had nothing to say. actually.
Yeah.
I mean, they could talk about their experience, but
Yeah.
they had nothing to offer. That's better.
Yeah.
But we think Christianity has something to offer in these moments.
Yeah, and it's not something that we've actually talked about a huge amount on this podcast. It is actually the kind of just the shocking nature of desperation at the cross of Jesus. Like, we'll often have spoken about its application in our lives, and what was achieved at the cross. But I think my sense coming into this podcast was actually that this is something that we just need to unpack a little bit for people, and to go, actually, the shock that people experience, that they are offended by, is something that they can bring to the scene of the cross of Christ, because there is a greater shock, and there is a greater offence, and there is a greater desperation in that place. And so in this moment, there's an offering to humanity that says every human experience that involves the sudden nature of death in these circumstances can be brought into this scene that has space for those moments.
So what does the cross offer that no other kind of worldview or religion does?
So it is the desolation of the Son of God crucified, the suffering of God on the cross. Which is why it's offensive to other faiths. So in particular Islam, the notion that even that God could become human is offensive to Islam. But the idea that he could suffer, which is why they believe that he was not crucified. Yeah. They believe that Jesus was a prophet, but he was not crucified. It is offensive. But that offer of, actually, here is a God who comes into the depravity of human suffering. So Tom Holland would say, the historian would say, that crucifixion is normalised by the virtue of Christians wearing crosses.
And we've got a pretty one behind us if you're watching on YouTube.
But actually, it's the most despicable form of torture known to humanity. It's an absolutely horrific death. It's not only is a guilty man set free, Barabbas, in place of an innocent man who's crucified. So he's unjustly given the verdict of guilty. The only verdict of which he is guilty is blasphemy, which is punishable by death under Jewish law, but they were not under Jewish law.
Although it's not blasphemy if you are actually God.
But it's not blasphemy. But as in their eyes.
Yeah, in their eyes.
Actually, he had not done anything wrong. Yes, you're right. But so it was an unjust trial. It was kind of trumped up charges, run through quickly. The whole thing smacked of injustice, and in the injustice both in the spiritual and in the legal being placed upon him. He was the scapegoat of everyone's anger, just as he is the scapegoat in eternity for our sin. So
that's your first point. There is actually when these moments arrive, when we come to suffering, and that's everything from the sudden grief and the loss of a loved one and death, as we're talking about, all the way down to, not down to, because I don't mean to downplay this, but depression and tough times and illness and everything, that difficult relationships, all the gambit of human life. You're saying that there is a God who, unlike other religions, says me too.
Yeah.
So I understand what you're going through. Yeah. I'm with you in your suffering. This is not something that is that the God of the ages doesn't understand, because the God of the ages has put himself through it. But actually, if you just draw the line there, I'd be like, well, that's fine. James, I don't need a God who just climbs into the pit with me.
Yeah.
I want to get out of the pit.
Yeah.
So push. Come on.
But in order to get out of the pit, you've got to go further into the pit, I'd say. So
that's fine. But that's the point. I'm not letting you just go. You got a God who suffers.
So you've got a God who suffers,
but
you've got a God who suffers despicably, horrifically, and a God who suffers in the context of emotional dispersal that goes on as well. So everyone who was with him is no longer with him, other than his mother and his friend John.
Okay.
And
I'm going to push you further. That's great. Okay.
So
So,
actually,
but then yeah, he suffered more than I can possibly imagine. How's that going to help me?
how's that going to help me? Well, so where it has helped me is I know that I can place myself in that scene in the context of death.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say, okay, this is a God who knows the suffering that I experience. And so it's not just that he notionally has come down, it's that actually he knows this. So what I feel, God knows and has felt himself. So when I pray to him and say, this is horrific, this loss is agonizing, I know that I'm praying to God who knows that and feels that and comes close to me in my heart because it's what he knows himself.
Yeah.
So there's the proximity, but the crucial and it is crucial, the appropriate word there is that this isn't the end.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So you have to get to that point. And what we talked about last time is that I find this, people who don't have hope and meaning will shy away from conversations about death. And particularly they'll shy away from conversations about death with me because they don't know how to go into it. It's like a conversational tomb that they don't know how to get out of. Because, as we said last week, they can't say, anyway, about the weather. But they know that I do, because they know that actually my route out of those conversations is I have a hope, because I know that there's one who came and he suffered, but he rose. And so I know that there is a hope on the other side of this meaninglessness that we're in.
And that, I think, that's what I was pushing you to. That's the crucial point, because actually, if my suffering has no meaning or purpose, it's particularly despicable. And then if there is a God and he just steps into my meaningless suffering and shares it with me, that's
great,
like...
thanks very much.
Yeah. I don't... it's like if I'm struggling with a project at work, I don't need my line manager to come down and sit next to me and go, this is really hard. I need them to come and fix it and show me a way out.
Yeah.
And so actually this suffering, the suffering of God, which therefore means that he understands, he knows, he's with us, takes us, as you said, to hope. And what's that hope?
The resurrection and life in eternity. So I know that I'm going to bear this grief. We know that we will bear the griefs and the sorrows in this life, but we know that there's a place where there's no sorrow, no sickness, no crying, and no death. Mm-hmm. And what we know is that as that future comes into the present, we know that our broken hearts get bound up. We know that the spirit that comforts us when we mourn is there, and we know that we can comfort others with the comfort that we've been given. And so people say things like the grief doesn't get any less; it just gets slightly easier, or you can't go around it, you can go through it. You can take those phrases can be helpful, but actually it's the knowledge that God is with me in this, and he's got a hope, and he's bringing that hope into the present, and he's bringing that hope into the present pain, not asking me to pretend that there isn't pain.
So when they were talking to the chaplain on the Liverpool thing, I didn't watch the whole thing, I only watched the first 20 minutes, but he spun, I think it's Hebrews 13:5 around, and he basically says the loss of the human life is that God says to us as humanity, I will never leave you or forsake you. Yeah. And the gospel is that he said is that you forsake and you leave. He basically said is that we forsake and we leave, and the stuff of life that causes suffering is as a direct result of us walking away from God and walking into rebellion. Yeah. The cost of which is, the Bible tells us, is our death. Yeah. And we get shocked by these sudden deaths because actually the thing that we never will name is we know it's all coming for us, and deep down we know we deserve it. And into this world steps the God who would suffer but would also take our death upon himself. Yeah. And so therefore offer us the new life of Easter Day if we would accept him. Yeah. And what that then does is transforms death is as a for the Christian is not as an end, but we've talked about this before, as a new beginning. So what the chaplain did yesterday was he said God says through the writer of Hebrews, he says, "I will never leave you or forsake you." And when you read it backwards, it says, "You forsake or you leave, I will never will I." And this idea that even though we've walked away from God, He hasn't given up on us.
Yeah.
And that in dying and rising to new life, Jesus has won for us a way back into eternity, to what you talked about: no more tears, and life of joy. And then that is what transforms that moment. So a few minutes ago we were talking about how when you saw the footage from before the funeral in Porto, you knew you were looking at a strong kind of Catholic culture country where on one level they do death well. So they knew that everybody turns out, they knew that who to carry the coffin, the girlfriend and the wife knew to be, but what we don't know, and this is, this is not anti-Catholicism, because actually all denominations suffer this, we don't know whether or not they have, were they still going, I wonder if he'll be, I'm not sure. Whereas actually when you know Jesus, even in that moment, the pain is real, but the hope is also real as well. I know, I know that my Savior lives, and one day I will see Him. Also means that I know that I will see my loved ones, and that's the bit that the shock of the cross brings in, which is what's happened in Texas, what's happened on a road in Spain, or what, as in one of the Liverpool players put in his Instagram, is yesterday it was somebody else's time, today it was Diogo and Andre's, tomorrow it could be ours. Live your life well. Now that was interesting because he basically did. He couldn't go to, but we know that we have, because he's a Muslim. So he basically was like, live your life well, and let's see how we're doing. Whereas actually, as Christians, we can say, yesterday it was somebody else's, today it was this person's, tomorrow it could be ours. But in Jesus, we know that eternity is also ours, and that's the thing that Christianity brings to play in this that no other worldview does.
Yes, and so what we want to do is we want to encourage everyone to allow the I would say, do not sanitize the scene of the crucifixion in your mind. Read it. Listen to people talking about it. Get to grips with its brutality. Learn to place yourself in that story. We cannot control the events of the world to know when sudden death will happen. And that's the lie that the culture almost kind of wants us to get to that point where everything can be controlled and known, and it can't. But what we can do is we can allow the God of the cross to obliterate the parts of our worldview that are false, so that when the shock of death comes to us, it isn't obliterating stuff that has been falsely placed there. So we can allow the grace and the mercy of God at the cross to shape us in such a way that we can never insure ourselves against shock, but we can at least allow God to give us a worldview that means that He isn't having to. We're not dealing with the dismantling of everything that we falsely believed, and then put the cross in the middle of it just for elegance.
So moments like these remind us that our life actually isn't in our hands. But because of the cross, our life can be in His hands.